Hey everybody, welcome back to Word Balloon, the comic book conversation show. John Suntress here. Guess who's back? Back again. Ed Brubaker. How about that, man? Fantastic. End of the week last week, I get an email from Ed. John, I got time. I'm sorry it's been so long. Let's talk about comics. Let's talk about what I've been doing in the last few years. Because it's been several years since Ed Brubaker's been back. I've missed him. And I've reached out, and it's so funny because so many listeners are like, man, when are you going to get Brubaker on? And it's like, I try, and I know he's busy, and he's writing television. He's writing the comics. It's more important, as I've said, and I said at the end of the interview, you got to make the donuts, man. That's why we keep coming back. We come back for Criminal. We are delighted when we learned that Ed Brubaker was on staff of the Westworld first season. And we're thrilled to hear about his brand new Amazon television series that they're just finishing up. You're going to hear about all of that. Of course, we talk about Criminal and All My Heroes Have Been Junkies, and just try to catch up in 6 years in a 2-hour conversation. But it's great, and I'm really thrilled that Ed is back, and he's a thoughtful guy. I've always appreciated his thoughts on comic book storytelling and now on television storytelling. He's got great stories, and I think it's going to be a benefit to all the aspiring writers out there to hear what Ed has to say. Really interesting stuff from Ed Brubaker on today's Word Balloon. It's all brought to you by the League of Word Balloon listeners, of course. Thank you very much, League, for your continued support via Patreon. If you'd like to subscribe to Word Balloon, want to help out the cause, you can go to patreon.com/wordballoon, or you can click on the Patreon ad right there at wordballoon.com. But thank you very much, League. This episode is also brought to you by Aftershock Comics, the independent comics and graphic novel publisher. They're sending shockwaves through your local comic shop with groundbreaking series. Some favorites like Walk Through Hell from Garth Ennis and Goran Sudzuka. There's Animosity from Marguerite Bennett and Raphael De La Tour. Dark Arc from Colin Bunn and Juan Doe. And new stuff like Oberon from Ryan Parrott and Milos Slavkovic. Stronghold from Phil Hester and Ryan Kelly. And coming soon, Dark Red from Tim Seeley and Colin Howell. Really neat stuff. It's been a great year already in 2019. Aftershock will continue. Also, Out of the Blue Volume 1 from Garth Ennis and Keith Burns. 72 pages of action, adventure, and aerial combat. It's in full color on the finest paper stock and in the popular oversized European hardcover format. Great stuff. Aftershock has it. Don't forget, if you'd like more information about these books and more, you can check out full story descriptions, preview art, and the order codes to get them through your local shop at AftershockComics.com. Don't forget to read dangerously this year with Aftershock Comics. All right, without further ado, let's get into our conversation with Ed Brubaker. So happy to welcome him back to Word Balloon. Ed Brubaker, I'm so glad you're back. Welcome back to Word Balloon. It has been years, but Ben, thank you for going, hey, I got time, let's talk.
Yeah. Who is this again? Sorry, no.
Exactly.
Just kidding. Yeah, no, I know. I've been meaning to get back to you for years. It feels like, and I don't think I even talked to you at all during the 5 years of the first 5 years of me and Sean's exclusive at Image.
I think you're right. I want to say, I think Velvet was the last thing we talked about.
Oh wow, yeah. That was right before then. So yeah, that's crazy.
There you go, man. Yeah, it's insane. But no, I'm glad you're back, and certainly a huge body of work. I've enjoyed, the Fade Out and everything, and Kill or Be Killed and everything, and of course, your graphic novel that you came out with, My Heroes Have Always Been Junkies.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, that was crazy.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you and Sean have the time, or I should say that Sean has the time and really is fully invested in your guys' collaboration, and it seems like you guys just go from project to project, and if there is a time when, okay, I need 6 months to do, whatever project or whatever, that Sean's able to fit it in, and still you guys keep cranking stuff out.
Yeah, I mean, for the last 10 years or so, anything that Sean has done on the side, the two things where he did Marvel Zombies, that was right before we did Criminal, and then at one point, Marvel made me take a break from doing stuff at Icon, and so they gave Sean one of those Dark Tower miniseries to work on at the same time, because I was like, well, Sean's depending on this.
Sure.
And I didn't want to lose Sean. It's Sean's one of the most consistent, like, cartoonists, like, as far as like output goes, and he's also amazing. And it's like, I feel like my entire productivity level is based on the fact that Sean just continues to need pages always. So yeah, I mean, right now, if he does anything on the side right now, it's usually just like some graphic novel that he'll take a couple years doing for like our French publisher, or, you know, he does a lot of illustration work and DVD covers for like Criterion and stuff. But yeah, mostly, I mean, we try to do, you know, 10 issues a year, the equivalent of 2 graphic novels or so. Like the last year we did, I think, you know, we did the graphic novel, which was, you know, about 3 comics worth of stuff. And then we did the last 6 issues of Kill or Be Killed to wrap that out. And some of those were like extra size. So we tend to do, you know, somewhere around, you know, a paperback's worth or graphic novels worth of stuff every year. And we have like 20 something books out through Image right now. It's kind of insane. But yeah, it's really, you know, that's the main thing. And keeping him fed with pages, even while working on like all the Hollywood stuff, has really been like a godsend in some ways, because if you ever have a day where you're dealing with like director or actor notes or studio notes, and you're looking at script pages and just feeling frustrated by not being in control, it's like you can go home and sit down and write, you know, 3 or 4 pages for, you know, I can go home and sit down and write 3 or 4 pages for Sean, and I know exactly, it's what I wrote. I know basically what it's going to look like, that he's always surprising me, you know, and it really, I feel, you know, the last 10 years, I appreciate it more and more every year, you know, that we're able to continue doing this, and that our audience just keeps growing. Like Kill or Be Killed, I think, was the most successful thing we've ever done, like as a team. Like it's reached like a lot more people than I expect, like a lot more new readers than you know, some of our other stuff. Young readers, a lot more young readers. Like when I did like a small book tour for My Heroes Have Always Been Junkies, I went to like 4 different places, and I met like a lot of people who'd started reading our stuff just with Kill or Be Killed, and now we're like starting to buy Criminal. And so it was really interesting to see that actually can happen. I just assumed everyone reading our books is the same people who's been there for like the last 15 years.
I hear you, man. And I read that observation in one of either it was in your newsletter or a recent interview that you had done. And yeah, that surprised me as well. And I mean, regardless, it's great. And I'm so glad that it is working, and you've been able to stick with creator owned and really, you know, just exclusively comic wise deal with that. I'm not surprised that the audience is growing, but on the other hand, I guess I did always think that, you know, we've all been on the same path since Sleeper with you guys. You know?
Yeah, that's kind of, I just assume everyone's like a long-term reader, but you know, then there's people who you run into who like used to read your stuff and now they're back to it, or they used to read stuff and now they hate everything you do. When I was on social media, I'd hear from those guys once in a while.
Good for you not being on social media anymore. I don't blame you, man. And of course you don't have the time. I know you're spinning plates. It's crazy.
That I never liked it. Even when I spent too much time on looking at Twitter, or, you know, I never had Facebook. I did MySpace, and then everyone switched to Facebook, and I was like, fuck that. And you know, I never even liked having that MySpace thing to deal with. So yeah, I'm a comics guy. Like I'm more comfortable, you know, like in a room full of nerds talking about, you know, like cartoons that we watched when we were 8 years old than I am, like, you know, going on Facebook and, you know, like
I hear you, man.
The generation who got bullied for liking the stuff that now is our entire pop culture. So sure. I don't know anyone I went to high school with, because most of them made me feel like shit for being into like punk rock and comic books. You know,
I understand. That's crazy.
Yeah, it's social media was not a positive experience for me, other than that I did meet, you know, some really cool people through the direct messages and stuff, and made some great connections that way. But once it got to the point where it was just every time you'd look, it was just people screaming about stuff. Even if you agreed with them, you're just like, oh my God, I can't be. Like I remember checking out for like a month off of Twitter and then checking in one day, and within like 5 minutes my blood pressure was just like everything was just designed to outrage, and I was like, I can't do this. It's not healthy for me. I read some interview with like one of the guys who made Crank, and he was talking about how for 2 years he didn't carry a cell phone anywhere with him, and like he said after like 3 days he stopped even thinking about his cell phone, and and he'd been completely addicted to looking at his phone constantly and checking email and looking at the news, and within 3 days of just making himself not think about it and go do other stuff, he started realizing like how much time he'd wasted. And that's exactly how I felt about social media. Like the first couple days I would glance back to see what other people were doing on Twitter or something. And then after like a week, I was like, God, I just don't care. And now when someone like posts like a tweet and an article, I'm like, Jesus Christ, we're still caring about what people on Twitter say.
Yeah. No, I hear you.
It's man. Like, you know, it's like the least effective way of trying to get your point across, but you can make it to a ton of people. So it's a really interesting thing. But yeah, it's funny because there were a lot of creative people who bailed on social media over the last like 5 or 6 years, and a lot of them are like crime writer friends of mine, and they were being pressured by their publisher to like have Facebook and Twitter and all this stuff to help promote their work. And they all told me that their work sold exactly the same after they got rid of social media. And like when I got rid of it, our work actually sold better when I didn't waste any of my hours of my day like looking at, you know, Twitter. Like I remember saying to a friend, like when I quit Twitter, I was like, I wish I could add up all the hours I spent reading things on Twitter and like get them back and just spend them reading novels. You know?
I hear you. But
because
also,
there were several where I didn't read a book, you know, because I was just looking at the internet, like reading articles on the internet, reading Twitter, reading, you know, clicking on links on Twitter to go read articles about, you know, and it's like, it's just sucks you into that endless web. And when you're sitting writing at a computer, you really have to try to prevent as many distractions as possible. Like I use that Freedom app when I write just to prevent myself from even going on the computer. And I just, you know, the only time it's frustrating is when I realize I need to look something up, you know, for like reference or something.
I understand, but also you do control your message and interact with your newsletter. I mean, I'm on your list and everything, and I get the updates.
Yeah, you know, that I've got. It's interesting too because I had something like 90,000 followers or 89,000 followers or something. I was in there early, like when I remember like back in the day when like Warren Ellis would tweet to people to follow someone, you'd suddenly go from, you know, 1,000 followers to like 50,000 followers. And, but like I would tweet, the most viewed tweet I ever had is not read by as many people who read my newsletter. Like my newsletter goes out to like 6,000 people right now.
Okay.
And, you know, and it's a much better experience because I'm able to preview art and process stuff. I answer questions in depth. It's like I can write an essay if I want. I can interview friends. You know, I can plug stuff with links so that you can go look at it. It's like the last couple ones I've started putting my favorite crime stories. So now like friends are sending me like weird crime articles all the time. So that's like a lot of fun. But yeah, it just, you know, I mean, I jumped onto the newsletter bandwagon, you know, like 2 years ago or something when I was getting off of Twitter. I realized like before I get off Twitter, I need to start this newsletter so I can grab some of these people that actually, you know, read my comics and aren't just bots or whatever, porn girls. I don't know. I never, you know, I did scans every now and then to see how many of my followers were real, and it seemed like 80% of them or so were actual, but you know, all that stuff is so funny. When they added analytics to Twitter, I felt like most people should have quit probably. But we're in a world where the news will report so-and-so on Twitter, and then you look at their account and you're like, oh, that person has 11 followers. You know? Like, I don't understand how that's newsworthy, but okay. You know, I don't want to be the asshole arguing for the return of gatekeepers, but you know, maybe quoting experts instead of just randos would be good.
I hear you, man. You're killing me. That's awesome. Well, let's get back to the books because I wanted to ask about My Heroes Have Always Been Junkies and stuff. How long has that been in your back pocket? Because it was a slight departure, a little more romantic and everything, and also kind of harken back to some of your early work. At least that was the feeling I got.
Yeah. Well, the title is something I've had in my head for a long time, maybe even 20 years. I've had like that title and knew that there was going to be a book called that someday. I just didn't know 100% what it was going to be. And then Sean really wanted to do, like both of us really wanted to do a graphic novel once we finished Kill or Be Killed, because Kill or Be Killed was like 20 chapters basically to tell one story, and we did it over the course of like 2 years, and we were both kind of exhausted, and we wanted to just do something that was, you know, like a novella basically. And we love like the European graphic album format. We talked about doing it in that format for a bit, but we just knew that the comic retail market would be much more supportive of something that was comic size, and even the bookstore market here in America too, you know, would prefer something that's closer to, you know, normal comic size. And I had seen, I've been buying a lot of those Neil Gaiman graphic novels that Dark Horse is putting out, where people adapt his short stories into like a 64-page book or something. Yeah. And I really liked How to Talk to Girls at Parties. I thought that was like both the, you know, like almost the perfect encapsulation of Neil Gaiman, like all in one book. Like the twins, you know, took this maybe 20-page short story, or maybe even less, I can't remember how long it is, and turned it into this, you know, 70-page book or something. And I had been trying to figure out how to do a graphic novel because Sean really wanted to do one, but, you know, I knew we couldn't do like 100 pages without, you know, like it would just be too crazy to have to take that much time to be off the stands, and Sean would be, you know, needing to get advances. We just start out so in the hole. And then I just thought, well, if we do something that's basically the equivalent of like 3 comic books, Sean can probably draw it relatively fast, you know. And I looked at that book and I was like, oh, that's a good example of how to fit the right amount of story into one of those. And then I was able to go like, you know, look at the original short story, and I'm like, okay, this gives me a better idea of, you know, how to actually, because I kept coming with stuff that was just like, it's going to be like 300 pages long if it has all this stuff in it. You know, I was like, this is not helping. And so when I sat down, I'm like, okay, I need to basically think of something that's like a short story and then expand it into like a graphic novella, because I was like, that was kind of my breakthrough. And then I realized, you know, okay, well, My Heroes Have Always Been Junkies. Like, it just started coming together. I started piecing together, you know, that it was going to be about the girl from Coward, and you know, that it was going to be about her childhood, you know, with her junkie mother, because, you know, I've always wanted to write about that. You know, I had like a alcoholic drug addict mother who took me to her AA meetings, and
wow,
for most of my childhood, me and my brother every Sunday and Saturday, a lot of the times would be, you know, spending our mornings at, you know, these meetings, you know, in these smoke-filled rooms where addicts get up and tell you, you know, either their funniest story or their most horrible story.
Sure.
And, you know, I was like 8 years old, 7 years old.
Wow.
Things. So
Jesus.
It was, I feel like in some ways, you know, it formed who I was to some degree, because
sure.
It not only did it give me sort of a love of, you know, that kind of raconteur storytelling, but all the stories were, you know, even the sad stories were basically tragic because they were all addicts, you know. So it was just something that really stuck with me my whole life, and something I'd always wanted to write about. And so figuring out a way to do that as like, you know, a criminal novella, basically, where I can take this crime story and then intersperse the character's personal history. So you're getting 2 different stories winding around each other that kind of collide at the end when you realize, you know, what she's really doing as opposed to what it seems like she's doing. And Sean had really been pushing me to do a romance graphic novel. He really wanted to do, he started out in like teen girl romance comics when he was like a 16-year-old artist, like when he first started getting published forever ago in England.
Yeah.
So he started out, you know, doing stuff that looks, you know, like I think he would acknowledge it was a little Jaime Hernandez-esque. And so, yeah, so he'd been really pushing for it to just be a romance comic. And, I told him what this one was going to be. And I'm like, I think this is as close as I can get to a romance comic. Like, I don't think I'm going to be able to do one that doesn't end up having like some sort of crime or murder in it somewhere just to keep driving it somehow. It's just like, it's my own like nervous tick, I guess. It's like, I'm happy to do the romance, but I also want there to be, this darker subtext usually. And, it was hard work actually, because we finished, Kill or Be Killed, and we had that set up, and we thought we had like 4 months to do everything. And then we found out that hardbacks take a month longer to print and distribute because of Diamond or the printer. I don't know what the deal is. Something to do with the binding process and the fact that it's harder for Diamond to process them all. So something I had never known, because all of our previous hardbacks are reprints of other stuff.
Right. Yeah. Sure.
So we were like getting it ready for print as if it was just a normal book that we were doing. But yeah, we had to suddenly, and that's when, because originally Sean and Jake were going to color it together. Like Sean, I think, was going to try and do a certain amount of the coloring himself and have Jake sort of, assist or do some of it, or maybe take over on pages here and there. And then with the time crunch, it was like, oh, well, let's hope Jake is really good, because now he has to color the whole thing. Like Sean, I think, colored the first 2 pages, and then Jake, just to give Jake an idea of what he wanted, basically. And then we would just give Jake notes. But he did an amazing job. I think it's probably the most auspicious debut of a colorist in the history of comics, honestly. Like, I can't think of anybody whose first professional coloring gig is that much of a standout job,
Yeah, absolutely. And I was looking at Criminal and noticed that obviously he did the first issue.
Yeah, he's our regular colorist now.
That's amazing.
Yeah, we're keeping it in the family.
That's really interesting, because, again, I was going to say I see the contrast. Had Sean been coloring previously himself?
No, Betty was coloring.
Oh, that's right, Betty. Shame on me.
About half of Fatale, and then she colored Kill or Be Killed and The Fade Out as well.
Yes,
and
yes,
then,
of course.
Yeah, Sean really he wanted to do this one, with his son, basically. And it's interesting because, Jake is, Sean's son, who was the one who was always happy to like pose for photos for like the kids in our comics and stuff. Like, we did an issue of Batman that was about like the cop who investigated the Wayne murders. And I think Jake posed for all the photos of young Bruce Wayne. It was like 20 years ago. And I'm pretty sure Jake actually posed for any photo ref in Coward for the little girl who then is the star of My Heroes Have Always Been Junkies, 13 years later. So I thought it was kind of interesting that he's been part of our work pretty much all along, and now we're paying him and he's coloring it. It's kind of insane.
Well, I really like, and shame on me for not remembering that Betty, did so much of Criminal and Fatale and the like, because I really think there was Jacob has come right in and given us what we expect in the regular issues of Criminal. But yeah, I love that watercolor look that he did for Junkies. I mean, it's beautiful. Yeah. It's very lush.
Yeah, he's doing all sorts of different effects and stuff. Sean, really encourages him to just color outside the lines, and he does have a flatter now. He didn't have a flatter for the book, actually, because there would have been no point in having a flatter, because almost none of it was actually representative color. It was just kind of its own thing. And he's doing. I keep encouraging more and more of that. Like in issue 3 of Criminal, I think is his best color job so far for us, where he's just, I think my one note that I gave him was that he colored some stuff a little. I was like, these people look too healthy. I was like, I think I said something like, the book should always be moody, but never in a good mood. This is like, those are my color notes. Like, I don't know how to talk about color at all.
Well, 3 hasn't come out yet, right?
No, I think it's like a week or 2 away.
Okay. Okay, because
it went to print like a week or so ago.
Okay, because I've read the first two.
The issue went way long. It's like 5 or 6 pages. It's almost like a 30-page issue because I had so much to try to fit into issues 2 and 3 should have just been a graphic novel probably themselves. But yeah, I was, stupidly decided I'd do a 2-issue story and there wasn't any like, oh, well, I'm just going to expand it. I was like, no one wants to read more than 2 issues of, this old comic book guy. And, but yeah, so Sean, Sean's always like writing as I'm sending him, 5 or 6 pages, 8 pages, 10 pages at a time if I'm lucky. And so, when we were getting down to the wire, I sent him the rest of the script and I'm like, so it kind of went really long. So he had to draw like the most pages he's ever drawn in a week to get the book out on time. And it's like one of the best art jobs he's ever done. I don't understand how he's able to like pull these reserves out. But yeah, I should have sent you a PDF of issue 3. But that was a story that had been, kind of nagging at the back of my head for a long time, this idea of doing a thing about a guy and his mentor. Because, I've had so many characters in my life throughout my teen years and older, like, these sort of older, wizened, hipster kind of comic book people or, not even inside comics always, just like people I've worked with at jobs and stuff that, you kind of start out in awe of and then you get to know. And I always just wanted to do a story like that. And comics is so rife with, these sad old figures.
Yes, absolutely. Did you read Chaikin's Hey Kids comics?
I stayed away from it because I was worried that, it might, because I knew I was going to read this story, but I'm going to check it out, But I wanted to. I'm sure some of the same little incidents that I reference here and there in Hal Crane's history are things he referenced with other fictional characters. But yeah, it's interesting. You spend your whole life working in comics, or you spend 20 years working in comics. You hear a lot of great stories from the 50s, 60s, 70s. Like the way it used to be. So I always kind of wanted to write about like one of those guys from the way it used to be, having to deal with, the way it was becoming.
No, and also I think it is different, very different from what Howard ended up doing. But I just love this idea. And yeah, man, I mean, God, you've been hearing those stories a lot longer than I have. And I'm fascinated by these periods as well. But before we get further into the current story, I loved the Teague Lawless little vignette. And I love that, that we're still, again, like you said, and you put it in your text pieces, that especially this current run is going to jump back and forth. And you've been really doing it throughout the series. I love that there are these core characters and core families that you guys keep coming back to.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I was working on Junkies, like the plan was that the next thing was going to be this other book that I couldn't land on a title for, which I should have known was part of the problem, but it was going to be this sort of not really a sequel, but another book in the same world of the Fade Out, and it was taking place in the late 50s instead, during the summer of 58, which is the summer that Los Angeles burned. And Christopher Reeve or George Reeves died. Like all sorts of stuff was happening in that summer.
Interesting.
At the end of, it was an interesting time. That was like the tail end of the whole Chavez Ravine, like everyone getting pushed out to build Dodger Stadium. And so there's a lot of stuff going on. And I was trying to wrap my hands around a lot of stuff. And it's still, I realized while we were working on Junkies, like, I needed more time to let that story percolate to figure out what it was going to be. And I also just really loved writing Criminal again. And I was like, you know what? I want to do some shorter pieces. And I also want to do the big story that all the Criminal books have sort of been building to at this point, which is, because you find out in Coward, that there was this character called Teague Lawless, who was this legendary character who died a long time ago. And, and then as you read the other books, you meet T. Lawless, but you already know that he died and how he died.
Yep.
So, like, I wanted to get back to that, but it's interesting. When I started writing, like, I had no idea, like, way back when, like 13 years ago when we started Criminal, or 14 years ago, that the Lawless family would end up being like the main characters. And I realized when I was working on Junkies that I've never actually written Ricky Lawless. Like, all the like Ricky Lawless stuff has been from the point of view of other characters.
Okay. Yeah.
In
Yeah.
Lawless, you see him briefly, but you're seeing him as other people talk about him. You're never actually interacting with Ricky Lawless or seeing him as a character. And I just thought, oh, okay, like, I need to tell the Ricky Lawless story now, because I've told a lot of the Tracy story. You know, we've seen bits and pieces of his childhood. We've seen a lot of bits and pieces of Teague's story. And, you know, so I wanted to do the first issue of Criminal, that one that was like this double, I mean, that one's like 40 pages long. And it's really, I wanted to do kind of the ultimate criminal story that would be a perfect, you know, reintroduction for people who know the world, or just like a perfect place to jump in if you've never heard of it before or checked it out before, because, you know, like, all the Criminal books, you know, even though now they have numbers on the spine, like, you can read them in any order. You can pick up any book. None of the books are like, oh, I need to read the next book now to find out what happened. Like, they're all like a complete novel, or collection of short stories. And I realized, like, I wanted to just take advantage of the monthly comic while it still exists. And, you know, I mean, hopefully it'll never go away completely, but it feels like, you know, monthly single issues are struggling a bit right now. I wanted to give retailers, you know, a book that wouldn't just be like, oh, I can wait for the trade on this. Like, obviously we're going to collect everything, but, you know, I wanted to give them, like, oh, I don't know what the next issue is going to be. You know, oh, this is, you know, so you do some single issue stories and people have no idea how you're going to collect it. And, you know, so I tried to do for the first issue, basically like the ultimate criminal story as like a, you know, as like a single issue thing. Like, you meet a lot of the cast, you kind of get a sense of the world, you see, you know, some of these characters' dilemmas, and then you're left with this hook of, like, you know what's coming. And, you know, that I knew, of course, that issues 2 and 3 would have nothing to do with issue 1, but it's not really true, because issue 3, which, you know, will probably be out by the time this airs. I don't know how fast you turn these around, but, Ricky Lawless is like a major character in this story, actually, in issue 3. And for me, the running theme through issues 1 through 4 is, you know, is getting to know Ricky Lawless. You're getting bits and pieces of the story of this kid's life and the story of his father's death and how it affected him, you know. And so you see more of that in issue 3, and issue 4 is a Ricky Lawless story from the early 90s. That's like, you know, a few years after his dad has been dead.
Wow.
And it's actually, yeah, it's weird. It's like, right now we're working on it. I still have a couple pages left to write, and Sean's, you know, about halfway through drawing it. It goes to print, I think, in like 3 or 4 weeks. Yeah, I think it's actually like the best one we've ever done. And I think partly because, like, Tracy Lawless isn't based on me. There's bits and pieces of Tracy Lawless history that are based on me.
Okay.
But, like, Ricky Lawless is much more like, when I was writing Lawless originally, I was thinking of my brother and you know, our childhood together, and how my brother was the much tougher one of us. And so that's why Ricky Lawless was the way he was in, you know, those other stories. Was like, Ricky Lawless was sort of like my nightmare version of who I might have become or something.
Sure. Interesting.
And, you know, I mean, Jacob's like that a little bit too, the character from issues 2 and 3. So
yeah.
All your characters are you to some degree anyway. I mean, yeah. Tracy Lawless is nothing like my actual brother, other than that my brother once joined the military.
Okay.
And is, you know, much more tight-lipped than me, obviously. But you know, but yeah, so it's just been a lot of fun to, like, sort of explore who Ricky Lawless is and design him as a character. And Sean's having so much fun drawing him, because, you know, he gets to draw someone with cool hair. But yeah, it's really fun in issue 3 when you see him like palling around with like Jacob and Hal, and like he goes to like the award ceremony with them and stuff. It's just like he's just kind of a really fun character to explore, and and then issue 4 is like a standalone story just about him, and then issue 5 starts something that's like a much bigger story that'll probably run to issue 12 or 13 or so. But that the way I'm trying to do that one is basically like it's telling like a big epic story through different narrators. So each issue will sort of be like a short story that builds on the one that came before it, kind of. And that gets us back to where we ended issue 1, kind of like that issue 5 starts a few months after issue 1 ends. And that's
interesting.
Like, it's the story of it's called the summer of, it's the whole story is going to be, I think, called the summer of '88. And it tells like the story of the last days of Teague Lawless, basically.
Very cool. That's awesome, man. No, I love it. I love you, jerking around with time and everything. I think that's great. I'm glad you mentioned it because I do think that first issue is exactly what a first issue always needs to be in terms of a satisfying read and that feeling of, okay, you know what we're about. Do you want to keep going or not? And I got no problem with obviously 2 and 3 taking that left turn into Hal and Jacob's story and everything. But yeah, it's great. I think that kind of crime element and the exploration of the backdrop of a comic convention and the typical comic culture and everything. Hal looks like Gil Kane to me. That's who I saw in Sean's drawing. I don't know.
Well, his name's a little like Gil Kane. Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I didn't really give Sean any visual reference for him other than, we just talked about old comic guys. He's obviously a mashup of, his history is a mashup of a bunch of different people's history. He's got bits of Alex Toth. He's got bits of Gil Kane. He's got bits of Stan Drake and, bits of John Buscema and, just like all these old guys who were around forever throughout the years. I mean, there's bits of Steve Ditko in him, but really I think there's lots of bits of me in him too. And the sort of, the way that when you've worked in that side of the industry, the work for hire side of the industry, like over time, even if you're treated well and have success, it can really just start to grind you down and make you feel bitter about the fact that, everyone else is making much more off of your work than you are, and it's a thing that I still struggle with, all the time, just trying not to feel at all bitter about, basically getting nothing for this stuff like that, is making people billions of dollars and, seeing kids come up to my house dressed up as the Winter Soldier for Halloween. And I'm like, okay, that's cool. Like, I do think it's cool, actually. I'm super into the fact that people love that character so much. So it's like it's a very complex thing how you can feel sort of burned and sort of proud at the same time. But I think it's something that people who've worked in comics their whole lives will certainly understand.
Well, I almost wondered if, and this might be something you can answer, but if the people at Marvel Television or the various showrunners that have been involved with some of the Marvel TV shows have come to you and said, I mean, would you ever see yourself working, in that capacity, given what you've been doing lately in TV as well?
Well, I haven't ever been offered anything. On the Winter Soldier movie, they had me come in and read like early drafts of the script and give feedback on that stuff. But I thought the guys were just doing a great job. And, I know obviously they've read all my, they were really into the Cap comics and they're really into the Marvels project. But, and I know those guys a bit. I know the screenwriters and, the Russos are really great to me. And cool. Kevin Feige's always been super nice to me. But yeah, they don't call me up and say, hey, you want to work on the Winter Soldier TV show?
Oh, okay. Yeah. I mean, that's what I was wondering.
Yeah, no, DC's more about that kind of stuff than Marvel is. DC's actually reached out to me a few times about trying to work on stuff, like when Jeff Johns was in charge there, especially, or John, is it John Berg?
John.
Those guys have both reached out to me about like Sleeper a bunch of times and stuff. But yeah, I'm more interested in, I just, I love the Winter Soldier is this huge thing, and if they wanted me to like consult with it, I would probably at least consider it. But yeah, I'm much more interested in like doing my own stuff and creating new stuff, or trying to figure out how to get TV shows and movies made of my own books, which a lot of which I just got the rights back to finally. So I'm sort of more focused on that side as opposed to helping build something for someone else. I spent more than half of my career doing that so far. So, it's a weird one. I don't, like I said, it's a struggle. People will listen to this and be like, oh, Brubaker's bitter. It's like, I'm not bitter, but there's part of me that's always going to be a little bit bitter. Just like there's part of Steve Ditko and Jack Kirby and, anybody, Steve Gerber, anybody who's ever created anything, the guys who created Superman spent most of their lives bitter, It's like, I'm sure there were many times when they were immensely proud of having created Superman, but at the same time, it's nothing's one thing, everything's multiple things.
Well, and also Gott, Siegel, and Schuster really had to be on the hardest of times, and thankfully guys like Neil Adams and others took up the cause and are like, okay, do something for these guys when they really, really need. Poor Joe Shuster, I know, was, living hand to mouth, and I know Jerry Siegel wasn't doing much better. But you're right, and at the end of the day, they got, a nice pension, but certainly nothing compared to the billions that Warner Brothers has made it in the decades since. Yeah.
About the end of Joe Shuster's life, and you're like, it's nice that they decided to do something during the last years of these guys' lives, but come on.
Yeah.
He created Superman.
Right.
He shouldn't have had to have been being like, he should have been living in a mansion and, had like nurses around all the time. He shouldn't have been like an old guy having to have his daughter take care of him. You know?
No, I hear you, man.
Some of those details wrong. I was reading about a lot of these guys when I was working on the issues 2 and 3 of Criminal. And it's just like, as a creator, you just start to feel angry.
Yeah, man. No, I know. And, we talked a lot about before Watchmen when those prequels were coming out from DC, and I really appreciated your point of view on it and everything, and obviously the concern about, when they've got the ability to take a project away from, the original creators. Are you going to watch the HBO Watchmen?
I don't know. Yeah, I think I will, because I've talked to Damon a little bit about it, and I know that Damon wrote to Alan Moore,
Awesome.
To basically say, here's what I'm doing. I know you'll never look at it. I know exactly how you feel about everything, but please don't put a curse on me. I remember years ago I got offered, or at least someone called me to see if I was interested in working with someone on developing League of Extraordinary Gentlemen as a TV show. And I said, well, yeah, I am, except Alan Moore's my favorite writer, and I could, in comics, Alan Moore is one of the most important writers to me when I was growing up, and I still think, V for Vendetta and From Hell and Watchmen are some of the best comics that came out ever. And
absolutely,
I couldn't go to sleep at night knowing Alan Moore hated my guts. I just couldn't. I couldn't be okay with it. If other people can be okay with that, okay. I get it. He sold League of Extraordinary Gentlemen himself, but I just knew, on some level, he would be pissing all over that project from on high.
I hear you.
Or on low, depending on where you perceive him being.
Wherever his snake god resides.
But, and it's I don't know Alan Moore. I wrote a letter to Alan Moore once, and he helped my career get going because I tried to do the right thing when I was asked to write a comic that was basically an aftermath story to The Killing Joke about Barbara and what happened to her and how she, moved on with life and stuff. And so it was this mini series we were doing when I worked on the Batman books, where each issue was a pivotal moment in Bat history. And I remember there was a moment I had to show flashbacks to The Killing Joke, and I thought, well, I'm not going to rewrite Alan Moore, so I'm just going to take the actual these panels, and I'm going to take his dialogue and put them in here. And so it was a page and a half of stuff over the course of 5 pages or something. I can't remember the exact details, But I asked DC to credit Alan Moore for that stuff and to pay him for those pages, and they refused because, it's work for hire. DC is the official author.
Yeah.
Can take, they can take something that someone else wrote and, cut scenes out of it and put it in other things if they want, to show flashbacks. Like, that's totally within their rights. I just didn't feel comfortable about it. Like, I'm not going to rewrite Alan Moore, but I'm also not going to get paid for his writing. So I took whatever was my meager page rate at the time. I think it was like $75 a page or something. And I got Alan Moore's address from somebody in San Francisco that knew him. And I wrote him a letter explaining the situation and included a check for, like 2 pages of my page rate, basically, and said, I'm sorry, DC wouldn't credit you. I tried to do the right thing, but I don't feel comfortable, taking money for your work, et cetera, et cetera. And I never heard from him specifically, but I got a call from Scott Dunbier who said, Alan Moore called me up and read me this letter that you wrote to him. And he said, this guy seems like a really good guy. You should give him some work. So what do you want to do at Wildstorm? Yeah. And that's how I ended up working at Wildstorm, basically.
Wow.
And, and then that ended up with Sleeper eventually. And so like it all came from that one moment where I just tried to do the right thing in the face of the work for hire machine, kind of. Not, it's like a small thing. It's not, I wasn't quitting my job or anything. It was just like, I just don't want to take money for someone else's work.
That's fantastic, man. That's amazing.
Cool. What's funny was like, he was doing a signing in London and I texted with someone who worked at the shop and I asked if they would give him a copy of Last of the Innocent, which, Last of the Innocent is sort of, it's a lot of different things, but one of the things that it is it has a lot of analogs, just like Watchmen does, and definitely Watchmen, was somewhat of an inspiration on that, just the idea of taking analogs and making them something else. And so they gave him that, and then the guy emailed me back and he said, yeah, Alan Moore told me this whole story about how you wrote him this letter, and I was like, God, that was like 15 years ago.
That's awesome.
Like he remembered everything about it, to like down to the minute detail, and how he called Scott Dunbier up, and I was like, wow, it's kind of amazing to me that these little things where you just like one little moment of trying to do the right thing instead of just going along with the system, and like I ended up having like I think a lot of my career based off of that moment.
I'm glad you mentioned Last of the Innocent because I didn't write down that I wanted to ask you about this, but it occurred to me, given that the inspiration for Last of the Innocents came from Archie and everything. Well, I always remember your quote, and I think we talked about it when you were doing either before or while you were doing Last of the Innocents, that your ideal retirement would be that you'd be writing Jughead comics. And
it's interesting. I've been offered both Archie and Jughead over the years since saying that, and I've ended up turning them down. And my ideal retirement now is actually just surfing.
There you go.
I think my ideal retirement plan will no longer include work.
I respect that. Absolutely.
No, actually, though, my real retirement plan probably will be to just do comics with Sean, and that's I guess one of us will eventually die first. But yeah, my real retirement plan is basically to just not have to do anything other than, my comics with Sean, whatever they be by that point. And, I'll do other comics. Like I'm working on a secret comic right now that I've just started with one of my favorite artists. And, then we'll probably announce that sometime in the next couple of months. And I don't even know how that's going to be published yet, whether it'll be a graphic novel or published in single issues or digital first or what. But I'm really excited about that. And, and I've got a couple other ideas for comics that I want to try and find the time to make. And, and then I'm working on a TV pilot. I've done a couple. I wrote a TV pilot last year but I started, just writing my own stuff more now. And so my ideal retirement plan would be, not having to juggle so many projects and just do, my one comic that I'm working on at a time for Sean. Like, it's just, I don't think I could could have normal life if I don't have to at least write something for Sean. Like I don't enjoy juggling a ton of stuff. It's hard to work in TV and write comics at the same time. I don't know how Brian Vaughan managed to be a showrunner on Under the Dome and doing like 4 comics on the side at the same time. Like that's fucking insane. Like I could barely juggle doing Velvet and the Fade Out while just being on staff at Westworld, not being like one of the people in charge really. But like when I was doing, Too Old to Die Young for Refn at Amazon, like just even getting the one comic for Sean done every month was a real labor of like trying to find the time, and sometimes having to wake up really early or stay up really late to make sure he's not running out of pages. And so it was, it was a struggle. I don't know how some of these guys do it, or Kirkman, who's doing so many books while being involved with so many different TV shows.
Yeah.
Like I just don't get that. So, but yeah, I mean, ideally, eventually at some point I'll be able to stop, working, and then I'll just work. I'll stop working and then I'll just write.
I hear you, man. Well, it's not, I think that's kind of what Chaykin's doing these days. After his little, or it wasn't a little stint in TV, his 10 or 20 years in TV.
Yeah,
so.
Hustles a lot more still. I feel like, well, he did for a while. I don't know how much he does now. I think maybe he just does his own comics, but he always has assistants and stuff. So
true.
He's got to be, hustling around like paying work and stuff still.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
You're right about that. I guess we should get into TV. Before we do, one thing I did want to ask regarding the comics still, I loved, and again, this is catch up for us, I loved the nod to Marvel horror black and whites, and I loved that criminal werewolf story, and I loved the format that you went back to the magazine and everything. That was fantastic. And the ads, everything about it was great.
We really enjoyed doing those magazine-sized ones, the Savage Sword of Criminal and the Deadly Hands of Criminal. Yeah, I thought about doing a third one that could be like Tomb of Criminal or something, but then it would seem like we were ending Criminal. But it was really interesting because those magazines, like over the course of about a year and a half, like those magazines, when we first did the first one, was the variant for the first issue of the Fade Out, and that one like got really good orders and sold out immediately, and that was it. It was like just this one-time thing. We're not going to print anymore because they cost so much to print magazines. And then we did the criminal ones, and the first one did really well, but the second one, by that point, I think retailers were realizing that like they didn't have places to display these magazines. So like the Deadly Hands of Criminal, like I think I'm going to be selling those at conventions for like the rest of my life because we printed so many.
Wow.
We sold a lot of the comic size versions of those too, but it was interesting, like talking to retailers and talking to readers, like the vast majority of comic book retailers would rather things just fit on their shelves. Like I heard from a lot of readers who were looking for the magazines and their retailers were telling them, oh, those are sold out, I can't get them. And it's like, well, that's not true. They're in stock at Diamond. But I get it. You don't want to order one copy of a magazine. You want to, if you can't stock like 10 for your shelf, you're not gonna get any at all. But yeah, so that was part of why My Heroes Have Always Been Junkies came about in like the deluxe format, because I realized a lot of our readers are kind of like, I want the deluxe version. And a lot of retailers are like, well, I ordered both of these and then everyone just wanted the magazines and then I can't restock the magazines. And so I was like, well, this version, and I reached out to retailers and told them this directly and like sent out like signed book plates and stuff to really help them sell the books, because I was like, look, your Brubaker and Phillips readers are going to want this thing, and they're not going to want to wait weeks to get reorders, because it's a hardback book. They're going to, go buy it on Amazon or something if it's not in stock. So, what can I do to help you guys get this? And, like this time I listened to you guys, I listened to readers, and everyone just wants the deluxe version. So that's the only version that's going to exist. And the book did really phenomenally because of
Interesting.
that.
That's great.
Yeah, we almost, I think we still have, a couple hundred copies left, but we sold through our print run on almost the first month. And then, so retailers really like bought into that. And then it won like the Diamond Award that retailers vote for like the best original graphic novel.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I was really thrilled because I wasn't sure how it would do. We'd never done anything like that before, but yeah, once I like reached out to retailers directly and sort of, basically thanked them for making this kind of book for us even possible because they built our entire, career.
Sure, absolutely. Well, but again, this is why I really appreciate when you guys come on and talk about process and not just storytelling, but also the commercial side and how important it is to talk to the retailers and really work with them. And I mean, again, you get it, and the successful image creators do in terms of, well, what can we do to make you sell this book easier and everything?
Yeah,
so.
I mean, it's I come out of the DIY, self-publishing and doing mini comics that we used to mail to people and zines, and I remember the indie comics days when we were just always fighting for shelf on store shelves, fighting for space on store shelves. And when I launched Criminal way back in the day, like twice a year or so, I would, my wife and I would like put these envelopes together and like some friends of ours would come over and help us. And I would like write a letter to retailers and I would sign every one. And we would print out posters for them and samples of, what's coming in the book, and just really sort of say, look, this is what we're doing. Please, give us a chance. And just doing that, like personally reaching out to people and showing them what you're doing, like it helps build so much faith among that community, I think, and let them know, what they're dealing with. Like I worked at 3 different comic stores in my youth, and I know what that job is like, and I'm sure it's harder now. The catalog is infinitely times bigger than it was when I worked at the store, and we had probably 10 different distributors we could have gone to, and that's just one. So yeah, I think I love comic stores. I grew up going to comic stores. I really want the comic store market to continue to be around, to thrive. I think it's gone through ups and downs over the years. A lot of people are doom and glooming it right now, but that's part of why issues 2 and 3 of Criminal take place in 1997, because those of us who've been around for a while remember the doom and gloom of 1997 when comics was dying and everything was imploding and it was all going to go away. Like that's when I started making a living in comics, the late 90s after all that stuff happened, and comics had a huge boom and everything in the world is about comics now, so sure. I certainly believe that it's possible for that market to, swing back the other way. And I think a lot of the doom and gloom stuff, is, I mean, people have a right to complain when they can't sell books, but I feel like a lot of those retailers are really smart and they're trying to figure out how to change their business and how to survive, because they're providing a unique experience to people who love comics.
Well, and you know us growing up in the era of record stores and bookstores and independent bookstores, which are also, I mean, certainly independent bookstores are on that same kind of footing in terms of,
but if you look, independent bookstores for the last like 5 or 6 years have been actually growing and expanding, and
there you go.
And sales through independent bookstores are up over like 20 years ago. So, I mean, we forget like the heyday of like book publishing when we think back to, like when The Great Gatsby was coming out or something. Well, The Great Gatsby sold 4,000 copies, and there were only 2,000 bookstores in the country.
Wow. Okay. Crazy.
Back then. So
yeah,
the direct market still has a lot of stores, and one of the stores that I go to probably doesn't even stock more than 20 Marvel or DC books each on their stands. Like they'll order stuff for their customers, but they only stock what they can sell. They're not like buying all the spin-offs and all that stuff.
Yep.
They're just like, I can't flood my own shelves. I need to curate my shelves. And I think I was reading a lot about the Comics Pro thing, and I think we're going to start seeing that much more aggressively from retailers. And the good retailers have been doing it for 5 or 10 years already, of just, being like, nope. I'm not going to buy into that, not going to buy into that, not going to buy into that. But, I've also spent the last 10 years hearing horror stories about, shops that decided to order 10,000 copies of a book so that they could get like a variant cover.
Yep.
And you're like, well, you're going to close your whole store to try to get a variant cover that you can sell on eBay.
Yep.
Like that drives me insane that's like a marketing tactic.
I agree, man. No, it's ruthless.
One of the main big people at one of the big two told me I should only start worrying about comics as an industry when lenticular covers came back. And, well, they came back a while ago.
Yes, they did. Well, all right, let's talk TV because I've been thrilled. I was excited to hear that you were part of Westworld when it was happening and everything. And tell me about the Westworld experience.
Yeah, that was really cool. It was... I had met Jonathan Nolan. He's called Jonah by his friends and people who work for him. I had met Jonah for dinner once, like when at some point, like someone just somehow like we got in touch with each other, and I was like coming down to LA for meetings, and I ended up like meeting him for dinner, and it was like something where he almost canceled, and then he found out I was flying out the next day, so he made it happen anyway. Like he had to fly to Toronto or New York that night for some emergency thing on Person of Interest that he had to take care of, and so he like met me for sushi dinner at like one of his favorite places. And then we talked a little bit just in general about, you know, he'd obviously read Gotham Central, and, you know, I don't know if he'd read any of the Catwoman stuff, but he was very familiar with my work. And, you know, I was obviously a fan of their stuff. I had a lot of questions about The Prestige because that's, you know, Memento and The Prestige are my favorite Chris Nolan movies.
That's cool.
And, you know, Jonah wrote the story that Memento is based on and wrote this and co-wrote the script for The Prestige. So I had a lot of questions about that.
Sure.
And then I think I ran into him. They were working on the script, I think, for Westworld at that point. And I asked him a little bit about it, and he didn't want to get too into it. And then I ran into him and his wife, Lisa, at like this local breakfast place that was near where I was living in LA at the time, and they were shooting the pilot. And I just talked to him for a couple minutes, and then a couple months later, I just got a call from my agents asking me if I wanted to meet about staffing on Westworld, and I was like, seriously? And then I thought about it because I wanted to develop my own stuff or, you know, hustle my books around or something, and I just thought, well, I've written a bunch of pilots that haven't gotten made. And I've made good money, and I'm getting healthcare and everything, but I want to learn how the sausage is actually made.
Sure.
I feel like, you know, in Hollywood, there's a shit ton of working writers who never get stuff produced. Like I was listening to a podcast interview, maybe it was Fresh Air with Jill Soloway, and she was talking about Transparent, and like Terry Gross asked her, did you tell your parent that you were writing a show about them? And she was like, well, I didn't until I knew it was really going to be a series and not just a pilot, because early in her, she's like, what we don't understand is like, I've had shows get produced and stuff. I've worked on produced television, but I've also spent 10 years writing pilots that either don't get filmed or don't get picked up to series. And one of my first pilots, she said, was about her and her group of friends in college. And when she wrote it, she like wrote to all of them to get permission after it had been sold, and they all wanted to like give notes and I'm getting a little bit wrong, but they all had thoughts, you know, and
sure,
deal with the idea that these people she was loosely basing her thing on were going to actually have thoughts about it. So she decided after that she would no longer have those conversations with people until the show was actually going to be a reality, which I thought was really funny. But it also shows you that, like, she's one of the most successful people in Hollywood. And for 10 years, she was writing things that weren't getting filmed. And coming out of comics, where everything you write, or most things you write, I have an issue of Batman, a couple issues of Batman, or I guess Detective Comics that I wrote that never got published, one of which got drawn and never published. And that was like right before I left working for DC. But most of the stuff I've written has been published, and generally it's published pretty close to how it was supposed to be. But you come to Hollywood and you get paid a lot of money to write like a TV pilot compared to how much you make doing comics, and you get, you know, in the Writers Guild, and you get good health care, and, you know, it's a great system. But going in, a lot of what you're going to write isn't going to get made. And you have to find a way to get over that fence of being a person whose work gets produced. Because, you can only go so long as an unproduced person in Hollywood. I mean, there are people who've probably had their entire careers as unproduced writers and made millions and millions of dollars and lived great lives. But I'm kind of used to things that I write getting seen by people. So, like I was not a young person arriving in Hollywood. I was in my early 40s, and I'd already been published for 20 years. And, so I was coming in as like, all right, I want to get stuff done. I want to get stuff made. I want to move quick. And nothing in Hollywood moves quick, for one thing. It moves quick suddenly when they want it to move quick. But there's shit tons of, waiting around for something to happen, or waiting around for someone to make a decision that nothing's going to happen. And that part of it was starting to drive me crazy. Like, I was literally thinking, all right, I guess I'm just going to go back to being comics full time and figure out this healthcare thing. Or maybe I'll freelance an episode of Special Victims, once a year if I'm lucky or something, just to keep the healthcare. And then I'll focus on, doing my work that'll get printed, because, I don't just write to write. I write, to publish, really. And in TV and film, publishing is getting the stuff made and seen by people. And, and regardless of how many people were involved in it, I felt like as the writer, I'm not going to be considered at all successful until stuff is getting made, in my mind. No matter what, even if I'm getting paid and making a good living and providing for my family, I'm still not going to feel like I actually accomplished anything. So I talked to my agents about the idea of staffing on someone else's show instead of just creating my own and co-show running it immediately. And I thought, well, it's going to be a really valuable experience. This thing, sounds like it's going to be one of the most amazing TV shows ever. And I'm going to, get this amazing experience of seeing how high-end TV is made.
Sure.
And, and so I went and I met with them about it, and I got offered to be on the show. And then I ended up getting a really good deal to come in at kind of a higher level, because I had so much experience as a writer already. So that was a lot of fun, but it was definitely a major, difference. I would say the last 4 years between working on Westworld and writing Too Old to Die Young at Amazon, I've never written more in my life. I've never bashed ideas around more. And I've been writing stories since I was a kid, and I've been being published since I was a teenager. But the sheer amount of writing and rewriting and breaking ideas apart and trying to make sure they work, and I felt like it was a crash course in some ways. And I felt really lucky to have come out of comics, where you have to learn to compartmentalize all the different projects you're working on, because I felt it kind of trains you to be able to move quick from idea to idea, or to shoot ideas down and move on to another idea. But yeah, I was really just kind of jumping into the deep end on Westworld to try to see how shows get made, and what this thing was going to be, and whether I would actually be good at being in a room with people. And so it was a really fun but insane experience. And if you've watched season 1 of that show, season 2 is really complicated and jumps around in time and stuff. But season 1, and when we were working on it, it was even more complicated than what ended up being there. So every timeline that you're oh, that's a different timeline, it's yeah, there was 3 other ones, or
wow,
not literally, but stuff like that. There were just so many moments where I was this is so complicated, how is it going to all come together? And it was a really fascinating experience, and but also really grueling, and really sometimes really, really long hours where, you're waiting for the showrunners to come into the room, and you've just been putting ideas up on a board that you need to run by them all, and it's, 7:30 or 8 at night, and you're waiting for them to come in because they've been dealing with, casting or the show or looking at cuts, or, there's so many moving parts. on. So it's really, it's a different experience being part of a writing room, and that writing room, especially because it was like a first season of an HBO show that was that complex. It's like initially when I talked to HBO about doing the job, it was going to be 3 or 4 months. And so I was like, I think I can do 3 or 4 months in an office. I've never been in an office in my entire, adult life. I think I had like one day as a temp, I think, when I was in my like late teens or early 20s. But my jobs have always been like, working at bookstores or gas stations or being a delivery driver. Like I've never been like really having to deal with any of that water cooler stuff, like,
Sure.
or having to deal with that many people. I remember you used to go to these like Marvel or DC summits, and I just think like, wow, it must be so stressful to have to be around this many people all day long. I get to sit at home in front of my keyboard and just type, and deal with like family and friends, and really control your schedule a lot. You get really used to that as a freelance writer, the ability to sort of go have lunch whenever you want to. So, it was interesting because for me, that was part of the learning curve of like learning like, oh, okay, I have to learn how to like give up freedom to some degree. And, and then it became fun. I started looking forward to going to the office and, made friends with the other writers. And it was just really fun to sit in these rooms and just sort of talk about these big stories that, and Lisa and Jonah, when they wrote the pilot, they had this whole huge pitch for the show. They told us like a 5-season pitch for where they wanted it to go.
Wow.
And a lot of stuff that was come up with, for season 1, ended up, being in season 2 actually, because, there were just so many ideas that they had for this show. And so we were sort of, helping or trying to help them sort of sculpt their ideas and build them into something and fill in the gaps and stuff. So it's a completely different job to sitting down and writing your own thing. It's really, more about learning how to work with people and learning how all the moving parts fit together and, learning when to shut up. And, I had notebooks and notebooks filled with just drawings that I would make while sitting at the table because, a lot of the time you're just sitting there, you're just listening and you're just trying to think. And so I would just doodle like while I was listening to everything. And a lot of people do that in writing rooms, I think. Like my friend Kath filled up these amazing notebooks with art while we're sitting in the room. But yeah, it was an intense experience. I ended up leaving season 1 early actually because, because I thought it was going to be 4 months, and then around 9 months in or so, I was just starting to break from just the sheer amount of the hours and not having enough time to write my comics. And Steve Epting was starting to get really unhappy with how slow my scripts were coming in for Velvet. And so, luckily I was able to, go to them and just kind of explain the situation. And they let me, go back to my normal life. And then, not long after I caught up on my comics, Refn finished his movie and wanted to work on our TV pilot again. And we finished that and sold that immediately. So it was like I had a bit of a break to just focus on comics and coming up with a new TV show idea with him, and then went right back into, the TV grind basically.
So what can you tell us about the Amazon show?
It's called Too Old to Die Young. It stars Miles Teller. It stars Miles Teller and John Hawkes and Jenna Malone and a bunch of other actors that you've probably never heard of. Probably half to a third of the show is in Spanish, actually.
Interesting.
Yeah, like 2 of the main leads in the show are Christina Rodlow and Augusto. I'm blank on his name. Hold on one second.
No problem.
You're gonna have to edit that too because he's
of course, no problem.
Augusto Aguilera, who was in the Predator movie, actually. Yeah, he was working on that right before he did our show. But yeah, he and Christina Rodlow are the two of the lead characters, and they speak mostly Spanish throughout the show. Yeah, it's basically, you know, what's out about the show is that it's about a bunch of characters who are involved in like a criminal underworld in Los Angeles. You know, Miles Teller plays a cop who sort of gets sucked into being part of, you know, a lot of bad stuff. And I'm trying not to spoil anything.
No, I understand.
And he's got a lot of secrets in his life, basically. And the show changed as we started working on it. Like, Refn's process is different than anybody else I've worked with ever. Like, we came up with all the stories together, and I would write the scripts, and he would give a lot of feedback and dialogue notes, sometimes even just sort of monologuing things. And I would, like, you know, our like writing room person would get all the dictation for whatever he monologued, and then I would take that and try to turn it into some kind of dialogue for someone. And so he's like really, you know, the co-writer director of it, and it's really more his vision than anybody's. But like, when it started out, it was more of a thing that I kind of understood as like a crime story that was just going to be like this sort of sexy crime thriller. But once he actually started shooting it, it became almost this existential meditation about the world and about America, and about how it feels like, and not just America, but all over the world, how it feels like the idea of society is a thing that's crumbling. And it's like, it's about a lot of things, like a lot of his stuff is, but it's like this really sexy looking show. It's shot by Darius Kanji. Most of the episodes are shot by Darius Kanji, who shot City of Lost Children and Seven and Delicatessen. And he's my favorite living cinematographer, I think. It looks amazing, but it is unlike anything anyone is expecting. I really don't think anyone is going to have a clue what this show is going to be. Like, if you think it's going to be about a guy who's a hitman who's becoming like a samurai, like, well, it is sort of that, but it's also all this other stuff too. And, you know, Jenna Malone's character is so different from where she started out, because Nick, you know, we write all this stuff, and then Nick gets with the actors on set, and part of his process is he'll run through things with them, and then he'll be completely unsatisfied with like whatever we've come up with, you know, or that we spent months like working on, and he'll literally just come up with something else that day. Like, he'll use whatever we wrote as like inspiration to do something else. And you know, at first it drove me crazy, because I was like, why don't you just follow the script? But then it was like, I saw there was like a method underneath his madness, is that this is just what he does. Like, he just, you know, for him, the script is the groundwork that everything else is built off of. And, you know, as the writer, that was aggravating as hell sometimes.
Sure.
But, you know, for his creative process as like a filmmaker, that's kind of what he needs. He needs that. He shoots in chronological order so that he has the ability to be on set and go, you know what, this scene isn't exciting me. What can I do that will excite me about this scene? What can I change? Or, you know, maybe what if we do this scene all silent, you know, or something like that. So his process is really fascinating, but also, you know, it requires a lot of trust from everybody working with him that it's going to end up somewhere, you know, because a lot of times you're like, okay, well then what is the scene? And it's like, well, we're going to find it, you know? So it was a very interesting process, totally different than working on Westworld. I was the main writer, and then about halfway through the season, we hired my friend Hallie Gross, who was a writer that I worked with on Westworld, and is one of my best friends. And she is currently like the co-writer of The Last of Us 2, so her schedule's crazy because she's in like an office in Santa Monica working on a video game that's going to be like the biggest video game launch, you know, of the decade probably, cool. Other than like Red Dead Redemption 2. And So we were meeting, she was carving out like a half a day here, a half a day there where she could come and meet with us. So like Hallie and I, sat with Nick and, wrote most of the show with him. And we didn't have like a whole other writing staff of people like most shows have. So, there are episodes where I probably wrote, 20 drafts and then it got to the point where when I saw like the cut version of it, I'm like, oh, and only half of what we even wrote is in here.
Interesting. Okay.
So yeah, it was a real learning process. But if I'd talked to any writers who'd ever worked with Refn before, I would hear the exact same thing. I mean, I have talked to some since then who were like, oh yeah, that's totally how it was on Drive too. He would be like, why do I need this scene? So it's really interesting. He's definitely, in his mind, we were making, a 15-hour movie, not like 10 episodes of a show. And like, I think Cliff Martinez did a masterclass about doing soundtrack work at the Rotterdam Film Festival recently. And you can see the whole thing. I think if you just punch in like Cliff Martinez Rotterdam masterclass into Google, there's like a 2+ hour video where he's like being interviewed about working with Refn and working with Soderbergh and, working on all his movies that he's worked on. And where he shows clips from all the different things and talks about how he designed the sound for those scenes and stuff. And Cliff revealed at that all of the episodes are 90 minutes long, which is true. They're basically
ambitious. That's great.
Like 10 interlinked movies. And he showed a clip that I was really surprised he showed because it's pretty brutal.
Wow.
But if you go and you look at that and you watch that clip, you'll have a good sense of what the show is. Like that really gives you a sense of, I mean, each episode's a bit different and, some of them really do feel like, oh, I'm in a completely different movie for a little while, which I think is really cool. Like, episode 2 is completely different than episode 1. So it's been a fascinating process, but yeah, it was definitely unreal compared to the traditional way of making TV that, my friends have done. And, that even Westworld was not traditional as far as, most shows go, just because it was such a huge budget thing and such a huge undertaking. But, it was fairly traditional in the way that it had a writing room and it had, it wasn't being run like an indie film. Whereas Nick really, he managed to figure out a way to make a show in LA on, a decent budget, but not like an insane budget. And, we filmed all over the valley. We never filmed in downtown LA, which is amazingly expensive to film in just because it's like $100,000 a day just to do parking in downtown LA when you're filming. Yeah, no, there's just a few people who own like most of the parking lots in downtown LA. And they know that when someone needs to film down there, they need to bring an entire crew and trucks and everything. So they are not passing up on 1,000 parking places for X amount of days. Like those parking places probably make them, $20,000 a day.
Wow.
Least. I mean, I don't know how much you make for a parking lot. I think parking lots make a lot of money. But yeah, it's the one thing I will say that writing for television has taught me is, I think something I always knew that writing was, but I'd never articulated to myself even, is the secret to writing. If anybody's listening still who cares about writing, the secret to writing is all writing is calling bullshit. That's all writing is, really. Calling bullshit on your own ideas. And, if you're writing by yourself, it's, do I buy this? Do I buy this? Do I buy this? That's all you're doing. And when you're in a writing room full of people, you get that really quickly. It's like so much of it is, can I sell this to these people? Will they buy this? Like if I buy it, if I believe this scene, then certainly they're going to believe it,
Sure.
Because I'm going to be the harshest critic on my own stuff always, because I'm the one who has to write the scene after that, So, I mean, that's really, to me, all writing is about is like, okay, does this come across as something that if I were watching this, would I believe this scene? or if I were reading this, would I believe this scene? Would I care? Would I want to move on to the next scene? And really, like when you're writing, you don't think about that as much, but that's what you're doing when you're sitting there with your notebook and you're outlining a story, because you're getting to this moment. Oftentimes you'll have an idea at the beginning of the story that, oh, this is going to be about this. And then you get to that moment and you're like, well, that scene doesn't really work, like,
Sure.
And then you're like, but you've read all this other stuff. So you're like, okay, well then what does, and that really, I learned a lot about that. I learned the value of kind of, kicking the tires a lot harder on everything. And, but the negative aspects, there are negative aspects to working in a writing room, I think. There are definitely, if you're a comic book person and you're coming to Hollywood wanting to be a TV writer, like, if you are not one of the people in charge of the show, like there are probably lots of shows where everyone's just having a good time. But if you're someone who's used to like writing and telling your own stories, like going from that to being like on someone else's writing staff, you have to understand you are helping someone else write their story. And you can put a lot of yourself into it, depending on who you are and what kind of writer you are and how big an ego you have or not. But it is not the same thing. If I didn't have my comics to write when I was at home, like when I was working on Westworld, I was getting up at 5:30 in the morning and writing comics for 2 hours every morning before I went to work. And that was the hours that, especially later when the hours at Westworld started to become longer and longer, and I started to feel more and more like, I really wish I was doing my own thing here because, I'm just helping them build a thing. And I'm like, I'm not, if I was 25 or 30, like it would have probably, been more of like, this is amazing. But for me, it was like, God, I wish I had more time to write my own stuff because that's what I had spent 20 years doing already.
Sure.
So for me, like the negative aspects was, and this has happened on both of the shows that I've worked on, when I got out of those rooms, I second guessed myself a lot when I sat down to write my own stuff. It's like I just said, all writing is calling bullshit, but you have to be able to move forward, like you have to keep moving forward. If Sean were not the monster of productivity that he is, like it could have been a nightmare. And like finishing the Fade Out, finishing, we're going directly from wrapping on the show to starting work on the graphic novel. Like I agonized over every decision in a way that I hadn't like before I got out of those writing rooms. Like, and it faded, like but it was like I was in my head and it was like I was thinking, oh, I need to run this by 7 people to make sure it's okay. And like there was something about the mental process of just going to the room every day and talking about writing that had gotten in my head a little bit. And I forgot that the thing, most writing is really just sitting down and facing it yourself.
I was going to ask regarding Westworld, and as you say, you're writing for somebody else. Were there specific characters that you felt you were able to make a difference on? Do you like any specific characters?
I don't know if I would go that far as to make a specific difference on. There was some stuff in episode 2 or in season 2. There were some characters that appeared in season 2 that I felt like were things that had been come up in the room, some of which were like things where I was like, well, what about this or what about that? And, but then they ended up not being able to fit in season 1 and I didn't think they'd at all appear. And then in season 2, I saw this one episode and I was like, oh, that was sort of like something I kind of pitched, sort of.
Okay.
So, but it's, when you're in a writing room with people like that, it's like there's these moments in comics, right? Like after the death of Captain America storyline happened, I read like 5 different interviews with people who all said it was their idea in that writing room. Like, David Gabriel was his idea. Someone else, it was their idea. It was Mark Miller's idea. It was everybody else's idea but mine. And I was like, well, I was there, and I was the one who was like, I don't want to have Cap go live for America or go to prison because I just did Daredevil in prison. So why don't we just kill him? And then and then we went around the room and voted, and then I like lobbied hard to have the death take place in Captain America instead of the end of Civil War. like I remember all this stuff. That's how I remember it. So
Sure.
But when you're in a writing room with people, or you're in a summit room and everyone's kicking around ideas, like everybody pitches in something, and there are people who will swear up and down that they were, the main thrust of coming up with the Winter Soldier. Like apparently, someone did a podcast where they talked about how the Winter Soldier was all their idea. And I'm like, well, no, that's not true at all, but whatever. And, you had the idea for having him have long hair, but, but at the same time, I can't discount anyone who was involved in the early parts of these conversations,
Sure.
Because, that's how you feel when you're part of those rooms. It's like everything is being created there in the room, but I know, because I had, 20 years of experience in comics, that really the on a TV show, the showrunners are the ones who are going to answer for the show, and they're going to get the most praise for the show if it's good, and they're the ones whose careers are going to, take the hit if the show tanks and sucks and everyone hates it, so. It's like how Marvel and DC are the real authors of Marvel and DC in the end. It's like that's kind of how it is with the TV show. It's like the TV show is the result of showrunners arguing with the network.
Sure.
Whatever compromises they can come up with between them that make the show into whatever it becomes. And there's shows that grow beyond that for sure. There's shows where the networks just trust the people to do it, and Westworld was given a huge amount of trust from HBO, and I think it really paid off for them, but, it's like Breaking Bad. Like Breaking Bad became like a huge thing, and I'm pretty sure Sony and AMC let them do whatever they wanted once it was huge, because it was like, well, you guys are just doing it. But yeah, those shows are few and far between. Like most shows are, like the network stuff where you're watching it and you're like, why are they all saying each other's names? Or why are they reminding each other how they know each other if they're lifelong friends? It's like, that's for you, viewer. So
yes,
it's an interesting world. I mean, the other thing about it is it's fun to get those jobs. It's fun to, like Kath and Hallie are two of my best friends in the world, and I wouldn't know them if not for Westworld,
Cool.
And, you meet people and you just want to keep working with them. And it's like, it's fun to sit around and come up with ideas for a TV show and then go into an editor's room like a week or two later and watch them cut together. And you're like, holy shit, I wrote that dialogue.
That's excellent.
Yeah.
Yeah, man.
I mean, there was little bits and pieces throughout the whole first season when we had these viewing parties at my house, and I had like a big living room with a projector. So I would have all the season 1 writers who didn't go back for season 2 would come over when Westworld was on Sunday nights, and we would have a couple margaritas and Mexican food, and then we would all watch Westworld and just have a good time basically, and relive our days of glory, I guess. But it was funny, like we would be watching the show and be like, wait, they did that or they changed that. It was really interesting, but it was fun. It was like this sense of camaraderie. This like reminded me of like the early days of comics and stuff, of like going to the shows with like, where I'd like hang out with Bendis or Frank Miller, or, like just the early days of breaking into comics, so I can see why so many people just want that as a career, to just be like a TV writer and be on like a writing staff. I think for a lot of people, it's probably the most rewarding thing that they could do, to just like write on any TV show, because it's like, it's a pretty great life. Like even your worst job in a TV writing room, you still get to sit around and talk about writing all day with like usually a bunch of really smart writers.
That's excellent, man. And, I'm reading the oral history of Battlestar Galactica that Mark Altman, and I forget the other guy's name is. They also wrote the Star Trek oral histories, and they did one on Buffy and Angel as well. And, yeah, it's interesting, like everything you're saying about being in a writer's room and things that happen after you leave the show, or ideas.
One of our editors, I think he was like, he wasn't our main editor, but one of our editors at Westworld was like one of the editors of Battlestar. So I would occasionally like go hang out in his office and get stories about Battlestar. And he was the guy who had cut that teaser that, remember when Battlestar first started and it was like a mini series, and then when it was a show, about 2 or 3 episodes in, it suddenly had this teaser at the beginning that explained the show to you.
Yes.
Like the Cylons have a plan. And this guy apparently like put that whole thing together, including like the text parts for it, because he was just trying to encapsulate, like, anybody can watch this like 30-second thing and understand what Battlestar is about. And the guy who was running Battlestar was just in love with that thing. So he was like, this is great. Now everyone's going to get the show immediately. And he said like a year later or so, he was in the editing room one day and one of the showrunners came in and he's like, so what do you think the plan is? And he's like, wait, you don't know? He's like, well, you're the one who said they have a plan. Like, I'm the
That's
editor.
Awesome. That's fantastic.
So it just totally cracked me up. I don't know how 100% true it is, but he told me that story, and I was just like, that's so perfect for that show.
That's amazing. And I got to interview very briefly, but still got to interview Edward James Olmos, who did that Coda post-show movie, The Plan. So he directed it, and it was, yeah. So that is, and also that reminds me of when I would talk to Lost writers, and it was, I can't remember his name now. He just wrote Discovery, and the first season is Discovery, and he was an office mate of Loeb's and Jeff Johns when they had the Empath Treehouse. Jesse Alexander. Jesse Alexander was telling me, and he said this on Word Balloon. When he was on Word Balloon, he was talking about how on Alias, that whole Nostradamus storyline of Rimbaldi and everything. He goes, oh, yeah, we had no plan. He goes, we were just,
Yeah, it's shocking
making it up
when
as we
you
went
find
along.
out from people who worked on, like, big shows like that or Lost, too, or, like, I mean, they had some ideas of what they were doing, but they didn't know for sure. And they certainly, like, you look at the fan sites about Lost that had all these intricate theories. I was, like, obsessed with that for a brief period of time. I would look at all those sites and be like, this is insane. The thing that kept hitting me on Lost was having gone into meetings with some TV executives and pitched TV shows and stuff. I knew there was no conceptual way that they could have pitched a show that complicated. If they were going to be like, and then the numbers mean this, and they connect to this scientist guy that no one's ever heard of from 500 years ago, and and it means all that, and it's like, whoa, dude. And then you read the like oral history stuff, and you're like, they didn't even know Locke was going to be in a wheelchair. Until they were shooting that episode, and then they're like, oh, you know what? Let's have the reveal be that he's in a wheelchair. So all the flashback scenes are he's sitting, but we won't realize he's in a wheelchair. And it's like, that was when the show was like, oh shit.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, there's always a certain amount of like planning versus improvisation in your great TV shows, I think, because so many things change as you're working on them too. And this is another thing that nobody thinks about. Like when we as outsiders look at like TV shows, especially, one of the things you don't even think about is you're dealing with hundreds and hundreds of people. Like what if some actor is great in their audition, but isn't nailing it on the show, and they were going to be a huge character, and then suddenly they become like a minor character, or they get killed off. Or when you're watching TV shows, like my wife is still really mad at Downton Abbey for Matthew's death. And I'm like, you can't really blame that on Downton Abbey. He quit. And Mary wasn't quitting, so they can't get rid of her because she's really the star of the show. She's the main focal point of the show right now, and she just married she married him and had a kid, and now he wants to go off and be a movie star. So it's like there's always those outside things. So it's like, well, killing him is like, what else is going to happen? Is he going to like, get some job where he like has to leave and never be around his wife and kid? Like, it's like those arguments about like, when they were trying to decide about how to deal with the whole spider marriage thing. And I remember anytime in the room, like the idea, well, can't they just break up? And it's like, no, you can't have divorced Spider-Man. It's like, oh, interesting. But, so it's really funny. There's always external things going in. And a lot of times media critics and stuff don't think about that side of it at all. There's a lot of stuff when I see people talking about like the comics industry. I'm always shocked at how few people who write about the comics industry really have any grasp of how decisions are actually made in the comics industry. But they always assert that, whatever thing they're saying is the right thing. And it's like, no, most of the comics industry's decisions are made on, will this make any money? Like literally, can we get this out on time and will anybody buy it? Or if we add, now it's like, if we add 25 variant covers, will it make enough money to be worth doing? And we need like a slot to fill because, ever since X company decided that they were going to get involved, we now only care about quarterly profits, so it's interesting because, having been inside some of these industries now, I'm like looking back at things and I'm like, wow, it's hard to really judge sometimes why things happen on a TV show or not, because it's like, well, I don't know. Like maybe that actor was a complete jerk.
Sure,
they needed to get rid of him, or maybe no one wanted to work with that one, or maybe the showrunner was, strung out on heroin. Apparently, like that kind of stuff will happen. It's like through the history of television, the last like 30. I mean, look at David Milch. Like openly admits that he was a heroin addict for like the first 5 years of like NYPD Blue or something.
Yeah.
And it was like he was in charge of that show, and it's like, well, you wonder why they never had scripts. Well, you just walk up to that and be like, you say this, you say this, you say this, and it's like, thank God he was a genius. but yeah, so it's a really interesting thing, and as viewers, really, we just can only judge by what we're given to view. So
right.
It's a really fascinating thing seeing how the sausage is made on the inside. But
well, that's why I appreciate you guys like you coming back and sharing your experiences and the reveals that happen as you are there while it's being made. No, I think it's amazing, and I'm not looking for stories out of school, but it's just like you said, the perception of how things were made is very different from what actually happens sometimes. Yeah, that's cool, man.
Yeah, it's weird though, like because like I went in with a perception of how it was going to be too,
Sure.
So it's like,
of course,
that was like part of the learning curve of it. Was like I had this idea of what writing rooms were like from having like watched TV shows about TV,
right?
And then you go into an actual writing room and you're like, holy shit, I'm 45 years old and sitting in a room with people who are talking about a story for the first time in my life, and it's not like Larry Sanders at all. So yeah, it was quite a learning experience. I will say that like one of the first days, Jonah pulled me aside and basically was like, just watch for a while. I felt so embarrassed because I was just like yes-anding everybody, and I was like, the guy who'd written tons of comics, so I was like trying to impress. I was like wanted to pitch an idea for every single thing that they were talking about, and it was clear that it was like, oh, okay, no, that's not how it is. And it's like, so I felt like admonished almost. I was like, damn it. I'm the guy who got pulled aside to be told, let other people talk. It's like, what a fucking surprise. You ask me one question and I answer for an hour. So,
well, you don't have to worry about that here, man, because again, this is great. No, and seriously, man, it sounds great. And it sounds like you're getting what you want out of your television experiences, learning how things work, and it's only going to strengthen as you move forward, like you said, and moving on to the other stuff that will be more your ideas. So no, I'm really glad that you thought to be a part of Westworld, and then now doing the Amazon show and everything that you're working on since. This is great.
Yeah, and it's really, as far as like taking that experience and turning it towards my own stuff, which is what I care about a lot more.
Yes,
is I learned how to work with other writers a lot more, like how to read other writers' scripts and either rewrite them or, give them feedback on something that needed to be changed. With the show with Refn, it was like constant rewriting and learning to get faster. I used to take 2 or 3 months to work on like a TV pilot or a movie script. I would take 6 months to a year sometimes working on, just juggling it around all my comics. And I didn't realize how quickly like screenwriters actually work. like TV shows are written in a week or two, usually, like the first draft, and then you get some notes, and then you have like a week to make changes, and and then you've got to move on to the next one, or you're going over budget. So there's all that stuff. But then like subsequently, because of that, like when Killer Be Killed was out, I was approached by this guy, Jeff Waxman, who was one of the producers of Vice, which was just at the Oscars, and he was one of the producers of the John Wick movies, and he wanted to option Killer Be Killed for Chad, who had directed, co-directed the first Wick and directed Wick 2 and 3. And I was able to take, this experience of having been in Westworld and been working with Refn and just say, well, look, here's how I want to do it. Like, if you guys want to do it, I want to work with you. I don't want to adapt it myself because I'm still writing the comic, but I want to work with whoever the writer is. I want to be, I want to help pick the writer for one thing. And I want to, be involved in giving notes on the script and sort of help guide the process and really be like a producer on the project. And so, that's all been going great. Like the writer I picked was this guy, Dan Casey, who now is writing the Fast and Furious movie. And, he's done a couple drafts, and I think we're waiting on like a new draft from him. And then I think that movie, fingers crossed, might actually go into production this year. And, and that was really, of all the times that someone's adapted my work, like this first off feels the closest to actually getting made, but also it feels like the closest to the actual material, where it's like, it's its own thing. It's a movie for sure. It's not, word for word the comic book, but it keeps the spirit of the comic book there. It doesn't toss out the comic and try to do something else, like a lot of people who tried to adapt, like Velvet or Incognito. Like a lot of the stuff I would see would just aggravate me, because it was like, well, why are you even working on it if you apparently think the whole thing should just be thrown out from the start and come up with something else that just has the same name, but that's, in the, like 10 years ago, when you would sell a comic book property to film, that's what they would do. They would give it green.
History of Violence. Absolutely. Yeah, perfect example.
Well, History of Violence and Road to Perdition are the two where, like, they kept what they liked from the thing and threw the rest out, and those ended up being good. I mean, that's what you should do to some degree. But, those were, I think there's a lot of things in the book versions that are a lot different. But, but yeah, like, 10 years ago, you sell your thing and they give it to some screenwriter, and the screenwriter's like, okay, well, what's the, I mean, they were throwing out Catwoman. They were doing Catwoman.
They totally threw out Catwoman.
Very Catwoman movie is nothing like any Catwoman comic that ever existed or ever would exist. And we like Darwin and I were doing Catwoman at the time when that happened, and we thought, like in some brief moment, we were like thinking maybe she would be wearing the costume we're doing, or or that it would have any relation to like the Catwoman that we were working on, just even as a character. And then, I don't think either of us actually watched the whole movie, but it was like, that was typical. And that was DC Comics, like, Warner Brothers, like throwing out their own, what made their own property cool and just trying to come up with something new, because comics are obviously stupid. Like that was how things were back then. Even 10 years ago, people would option a comic property, take the name and give it to some screenwriter who would do something else entirely, and make it their own thing instead of adapt the work. But now, we've got a lot of people from comics who work in Hollywood who really understand, comic books as a work, as like a industry, or not an industry, but as an art form, and understand the history of it and understand the history of these characters when they're working on like the Marvel and DC stuff. I mean, look at that Spider-Man animated movie. I'm pretty sure when that was greenlit, someone thought it was going to be a direct-to-video thing, and it ends up being one of the best superhero movies that's ever been made, because, superheroes and Spider-Man especially are so well known that it's time to be able to do like crazy stuff with them,
Absolutely.
And bring in stuff, and it doesn't stall people when they're like, wait, what's this Spider-Man? It's like, well, wait 5 seconds and they're going to explain it, and everyone kind of goes along with it. And it's like, that movie was amazing. Yeah. But, 10 years ago, or, I guess Spider-Man's a unique one. though, even if you go back and you look at like when they were trying to make like Captain America a TV show back in the 70s or whatever, they always just throw out all the stuff. They never they never, like, the Marvel movies were the first time that they really just were like, well, what's right about this that we should stick with? And it's like, thank God for Kevin Feige on that level, because, he really gets it. He reads those comics and is like, well, this part would work great in a movie and this part would work great in a movie. And that other stuff doesn't matter, but it's crazy to see how that switched. But having lived through some of it, I'm now glad to be in a position where, I know a lot about how TV and film work. And, I have these properties at a time period when Hollywood is much more interested in like figuring out how to actually adapt what's right about it, instead of just, well, we bought this thing, but we don't know what it is. And, I lived through, we bought this thing, but we don't know what it is quite a few times. And it's like, oof, like, thank God that's over.
Well, yeah. And you know how to play the game a little bit better now. No, man, I'm really thrilled for you. Honestly, I'm excited to hear what's going to come next.
Hopefully, the next thing that will be announced will be the new comic book that I'm working on, which I can't say anything about, but I'm very excited about it. It's the only thing I'll say is it's basically a young adult book for adults.
Okay, all right, interesting.
Not really, but it's sort of like an R-rated version of a young adult book.
Interesting.
Where it sprang out of. It's becoming something else as we start to work on it. But yeah, it's just a crazy idea that I came up with after getting asked to come up with something for one of my favorite artists who I've never done a long collaboration with. So I'm excited. I was really, after I wrapped on the TV show for Amazon, we bought a house up north of LA in a little beach town, and we just moved up here. And I just I spent about half my time basically up in this little quiet beach town and going to the beach and going in the ocean and stuff. And then I go down to LA for a couple weeks at a time for like meetings or doctor's appointments or something. And it's been an interesting life, but for about 4 or 5 months, I was so exhausted from the TV show that I barely remember like writing the graphic novel. Honestly,
wow.
I was just trying to keep up with Sean. I was like, thank God I wrote this outline before my exhaustion hit. But yeah, I just like both that one and Westworld. It's like, I would tell any I would give them the same advice Brian Vaughn, and Robert Kirkman gave me, which is like, know what you're getting into, and know that, it's not always just going to be fun. It's going to be frustrating. It's going to be different than writing your own stuff. It's going to be, long hours sometimes when you're used to being able to just go take a nap whenever you want,
Sure.
And it's going to be a thing where even when it's over, you're going to be like, God damn, like our show was in production for 10 months. Like, that's not normal. Like, we had a 10-month shoot for a 10-episode thing. And, that was just because Breffen was able to convince Amazon early on to sort of give him whatever he wanted. And, I had no clue going into that exactly how exhausting a 10-month production would be. And especially with one director shooting all of it, like, I don't know how he survived at all, because I think he was getting 3 or 4 hours sleep a night, if that, for most of the year, and
wow.
Yeah, no, I mean, there were days when I would look at him and I'd be like, oh man, he's gonna like have a nervous breakdown.
Wow.
Like this is not healthy, like a healthy way to live at all. Like,
yeah.
Nobody, we were going from, we were taking like a weekend off between episodes and starting shooting the next one on a Monday often. It was like he was getting almost no break. And, it's grueling, and it will take it out of you physically, like in a way that even the grind of monthly comics, you can kind of get used to that rhythm, and it's exhausting. If you're writing 3 or 4 comics for like Marvel or DC or something, like it's exhausting to do that. but you can kind of get into the swing of it, and it's exciting because a lot of it you're just sort of spending, 8 or 10 hours a day sitting in your home office, like coming up with ideas for things for Batman or Captain America to do, but that writing room experience and working on a TV show in production, sometimes just the phone calls about stuff, or like the looking at stuff and writing up notes and stuff, you'll finish that and you'll have no energy left because you've had to like concentrate for so many hours on so many different things at a time. It's just, it's a completely different skill set to just being a writer or a novelist or a comic book writer or anything like that. Like, you really have to retrain yourself. And one of the other key things, and this will be my last note for people to remember, is the key difference between something like comics or a novel and screenwriting, especially TV writing, is a script is a living document up until it's done being edited. Like, up until the show itself is done being edited. Like, in comics, like when our comic gets published, like, especially, I mean, there's like, maybe I can change a few things between the serialization and the trade paperback or hardback, but when the comic is published, generally once I've sent pages to Sean, that's it. Unless he draws something, I'm like, oh, could you change this? Usually that's it. It's when I'm done writing a script, that's it, and I move on to the next thing. With a screenplay or a TV pilot or an episode of a show, it is a living, breathing thing, and that is a big mindfuck at first. You have to really get your head around the idea that you're writing something that is at best good for now. This will do for now. You'll hear a lot. Well, this is good enough. This will get us to being able to figure out if this is going to be the thing. Like, so, and there's just a certain amount of constant rewriting. Even once a script is locked, you're adjusting dialogue, you're adjusting things, you're meeting with actors and going over dialogue, and you're like, oh, that sounds weird coming out of their mouth. So you adjust that, or, and so that was a big mindfuck to me to like know. Once I gave into that and was okay with like, okay, so when you're screenwriting, you're basically never done. Everything's always in a partially finished thing. Even if you think it's brilliant and it's done, it's not done, because, there's going to be actors, there's going to be directors, there's going to be executives, there's going to be studio people, and everyone's going to have something to say about it. And maybe even, good notes, bad notes, whatever. Maybe they'll have a note that makes you think of something, and you go back and you look at it and you're like, oh, thank God this hasn't been shot yet, so I can change this. So it's really about that to me. That's the other main thing. It's like calling bullshit and understanding that nothing is actually finished in screenwriting. You can write the best screenplay of all time, and whoever directs it is going to change a bunch of stuff. It's just going to happen. And then the studio is going to force them to change a bunch of stuff when they're editing. And like Refn and a lot of other directors will always say, you write one movie, you film a different movie, and then you edit a third movie. And then whatever comes out is generally not that close to what you thought it was going to be. Like, hopefully it comes out with something good. So getting my head around that, coming from comics, where it's like, I finished this thing, Sean drew it, it was published a month later, like that is the thing I had spent 20 years being used to. Sure. From the time I would like draw a comic and go to Kinko's and print it myself, and hand them out at parties to friends. But like, I literally started out at that point. So like going to a thing where it's like, like I've had a movie script I've worked on and off for almost a decade that may or may not get made now. And it's like, every time I go back and look at it, I'm like, oh, I forgot I wrote this part. Or, it's like, there's always something that needs to be changed. And if a new director joins and they have a bunch of notes. And so it's just this constantly evolving process of, that's what screenwriting is. It's like this constantly, you're chasing something and you may never actually catch it.
Interesting.
It's a really interesting thing. It's totally different than writing comics. In some ways there's a freedom to knowing that, whatever you're writing is temporary and is probably going to change, because you'll end up writing a lot of stuff that you'll be like, well, I don't know if this is going to land or not, So and then a lot of that stuff ends up on screen, So it's a really interesting process. I think as someone who grew up writing and drawing comics, I much prefer the amount of control that I have, where it's me and Sean and then Jake coloring it. And, I much prefer that. If every comic Sean and I did sold 100,000 copies, I would, probably not try as hard to continue being a screenwriter, because I would be creatively satisfied and so well.
Yeah.
As it is, it's like I really actually like a lot of aspects of screenwriting and a lot of aspects of working in TV, but I really love being in the Writers Guild and having like the best healthcare I've ever had in my entire life, and being able to, support my family and own a home.
Honestly, man, this all sounds great, and I'm so glad that things are working out on both ends, and that you're finding the time to make good television and also make great comics as well.
Well,
and thank God, absolutely, man, Criminal is back, and I'm thrilled. And if people haven't picked up My Heroes Have Always Been Junkies, they should pick that up as well. And I'm glad that it received the awards and attention that it did, and that it succeeded. And now you said you got a new thing coming up in a few months. Now I feel like you're partially obligated to come back sooner than 6 years.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll probably come back sooner than 6 years. Sorry for the long delay. That's just how long it takes to get a podcast made. You guys don't know the process.
No, man, we want you. I always say this because Art Baltazar sometimes can't do my other podcast, and I'm like, dude, people want you to make the donuts, and you're making the donuts, so that's good.
Yeah.
You can talk about it when you have time and everything. And I, as always, appreciate you coming back and sharing your experiences with the Word Balloon audience. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
How about that? Ed Brubaker back on Word Balloon. Thank God. I was starting to worry and panic a little bit that maybe it's me. Do I smell? You never know. Great to hear from Ed. Looking forward to our next conversation, and more great March conversations on the way right here on wordballoon.com. I have made a lot of preparation, and more big stars, more interesting new creators as well. Very cool stuff. Some new publishers in the mix. I think you're going to enjoy the conversations to come for the rest of March right here on Word Balloon. It's brought to you by Aftershock Comics. Now, we've been talking about Aftershock Comics for months. They're a proud sponsor of Word Balloon, and this year, 2019, is the year of reading dangerously. Don't forget about books like Animosity from Marguerite Bennett and Raphael de la Tour. Not only the volumes that they've already cranked out, but of course Free Comic Book Day coming in May. That's going to be Aftershock Comics' free comic book. There's A Walk Through Hell from Garth Ennis and Gordon Suzuka, as well as Out of the Blue from Garth Ennis and Keith Burns. We talked a couple weeks ago to Phil Hester about his new book Stronghold with him and Ryan Kelly. And we also talked to Tim Seeley about his new book with Corin Howell. That is Dark Red, a book about vampirism in the heartland of America. Good stuff from Tim. Really interesting stuff coming along the way as well. More neat books all throughout 2019 from Aftershock Comics. Go to their website. You'll find out more information there, including the diamond codes on how to order the books through your local shop at aftershockcomics.com. Thanks a lot for listening. Thank you, League of Word Balloon listeners, for your continued support. And thank you for your attention, as always, man. We're having a hell of a 2019 so far, and I'm very excited about what's already planned for March, as I said, and in the months ahead. So keep it right here on wordballoon.com. Until next time, Word Balloon is a copyright feature of Shaky Productions, copyright 2019.